It played a much larger role than people have liked to think. He was a political man, he was involved in politics, and he was best friends with arguably one of the worst American presidents, which is saying something, Franklin Pierce. They met at college. They were at Bowdoin together. Pierce was a year ahead of Hawthorne. Pierce was a very gregarious, outgoing, warm, and genial person, and he and Hawthorne became friends. They actually marched together in a little group called the Bowdoin Cadets. One doesn't think of Hawthorne marching, and certainly not marching behind anyone, but they did. And also, politics at Bowdoin was very important. They were both what became Democrats. They were Jeffersonian Republicans at the time. So that was a very important connection between the two men then. And they stayed friends for their entire lives. Pierce was actually the class ahead of Hawthorne. It was Hawthorne's class, which was the class of 25, was very well known because I think John Russwurm, who was the first president of Liberia, the colony, the American colony where emancipated slaves were sent for a while. He was a member of the Bowdoin class. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, from a whole other perspective, was a member of the Bowdoin class. Another very good friend of Hawthorne's, Horatio Bridge, was a member of that class. So it was a famous class still, I think, in Bowdoin annals. Oh, it's hard to say. Probably as a school child, I remember reading The Minister's Black Veil, which school children had to do, and being completely horrified, and I never forgot it. I was horrified because I didn't understand it. And later I realized it was all right not to understand it. So I think Hawthorne grabs people at a certain point in one's life and never lets go. And long after I decided to write a biography of Hawthorne, I realized that my previous book, which was on a very different subject, Gertrude Stein and her brother Leo, actually began with an epigraph from Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. So obviously I'd been thinking about him for a long time. He was born in 1804. The bicentennial of his birth is coming up next year, July 4th, 1804, and he died in 1864, just before the end of the Civil War. Yeah, he was anxious about turning 60. Most people, he'd already said, you know, he didn't think he'd lived past 21 in that kind of romantic flourish. When he told Peabody that, Peabody was his sister-in-law, he was ill. He was ill by that time. And one way of interpreting it is to say he didn't want to live as an ailing and failing person. He was born in Salem, Massachusetts. He's descended from very famous Salem Hawthornes actually, as the name was spelled. But he also lived in Concord, Massachusetts for a time. He lived in Lenox for a time. He lived in Liverpool, England for a time. He lived in Rome for a time. For a brief time, he lived in Florence one summer. And then at the end of his life, he'd come back to Concord where he'd bought a house. And he lived and was buried in Concord. I don't know. It's a good question. The reason I brought it up was what I said at the end was that it was enough to keep him out of the almshouse. By the end of his life, because he'd been ill, and when you're ill, you can't write, and he didn't have political jobs, he was worried about the maintenance of his family. He had a wife and 3 children. So $26,000 was more than it was enough to make him comfortable. I mean, it included his real estate and so forth. It wasn't a huge amount by any means at all, but it was more than he thought he had. He'd saved a lot of that money while he was the consulship, while he was consul for Liverpool under the Pierce administration. And part of the reason he took that job was to make, it was a very lucrative job to make that money. Well, he was too old to fight, and had he, it's unclear whether he would have wanted to or not. Some days he felt he wanted to grab that musket and shoot someone, but mostly he was so horrified by the bloodletting that was the Civil War, because daily there were reports of friends of his, children or nephews being lost or maimed or run away, something like that. And he was aghast at the whole thing. He he was brutalized by the war, and he was very critical of the North and of the South, both. I would say he was anti-war, yeah, which is an anomalous thing to be in that time. It's almost as if, you know, the modern corollary would be anti-war, although some people were, Robert Lowell, during the Second World War. And now to us we think, well, how could you have been anti-Nazi? How could you have been anti-war? Well, there was in the Civil War, for a Northerner living in Concord, Massachusetts, neighbor of Thoreau, neighbor of Emerson, to be anti-war when, in point of fact, the war was being fought from these people's point of view to emancipate the slaves, you know, to get rid of slavery, is a strange position. The Scarlet Letter, the most famous, absolutely the most famous, The House of the Seven Gables. The Scarlet Letter is still sort of a mainstay, canonical mainstay in school curricula all throughout the country. The House of Seven Gables, the Blithedale Romance, not read as often, but a strange little book, and The Marble Fawn. Those are the four main Hawthorne books. And he's also known for stories like the one I mentioned, The Minister's Black Veil, The Birthmark, Rappaccini's Daughter, whichever one happens to be somebody's favorite that they read, as I did, you know, when they were about 12 years old. No, he never sold a lot. I think he made overall, between the time of the publication, 1850, The Scarlet Letter, and the time of his death, 1864, he sold 13,500 copies. That was in a 14-year period, 300,000 copies of Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1 year. So that gives you a sense of the difference. The Scarlet Letter was a success d'estime. People knew of it. It was an important book. But people weren't running out to buy it in the same way they were running out to buy, you know, Stowe's book on one hand, or The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which became an international bestseller in the 1840s. Hawthorne was a much more specialized, or writer for a more specialized audience. People knew of the book. It had a certain kind of fame, but it didn't have what you'd call popular, almost journalistic success. And that, of course, was hard for him. He has a terrible and famous phrase about the damned mob of scribbling women. And what he means by that, although it's complicated, is he means these were women, primarily, who were writing topical books about current events, who were selling much more than he was, and certainly much more than, say, Melville, who didn't, you know, whose Moby Dick was an abysmal failure, something like that. He did have a relationship with Melville. I mean everything by it. I mean, we can't know literally what is meant by it. Melville, Hawthorne was older than Melville. Melville lost his father. Melville had a kind of polymorphous sexuality. He was very open to attachments to men, women, things, whales, what have you. And when he read Hawthorne, Mosses from an Old Man's group of short stories, and just at the same time as that he met Hawthorne, it's unclear which happened first, he was overwhelmed. He was overpowered by the man who was so enormously handsome, so smart, so reserved, so satiric, and so philosophically compatible, both in his person and in his writing. So Melville was enamored of him, and Melville always wore his heart on his sleeve and wrote gushing, erotic letters to Hawthorne. The sad thing is that Hawthorne's letters don't survive, so we don't really know his side of the correspondence, but he was a very different kind of man than Melville was. And so if you divide the world into Melville lovers and Hawthorne lovers, as spurious a way to divide the world as any, then people who love Melville often dislike Hawthorne because they feel that Hawthorne rejected Melville, and so forth and so on. It's not true. They were good friends. I don't think Hawthorne was in love with Melville, though. Quite a number, starting at the Boston Custom House before he was married in the 1830s, and that required political maneuvering of George Bancroft through Elizabeth Peabody, the woman who became his sister-in-law. So that was an early one. Well, because first of all, because he wrote one of the first and very important histories of the United States, you know, multi-volume history of the United States, where he gave, he in some sense started the whole view of America. I mean, it was always part of sort of the American scene, but America is getting better and better. It's progressive history. So he was a kind of progressive historian, and he also saw America as kind of the great white hope of democracy, you know, sort of changing the world. He was also a very important Democratic Party leader, and he had several important posts in various administrations. And in Massachusetts, where he lived, he pulled a lot of levers for Democratic operatives. So he's very important in lots of ways. He has a finger almost in every pot. Well, it was a clearinghouse for imported and exported, but primarily imported goods coming into the country. And all of the commerce, international commerce, was done by ship. And so where Hawthorne was from, Salem, for example, in the 18th century and about until the time of Hawthorne's birth in early years, 1804 to about 1811, Salem was a major port of entry for goods coming from as far away as China, for example. The Far East Seas East India Company all came in through Salem. It actually surpassed Boston as a kind of port of entry. So it was very, very important maritime commercial center. Later Boston surpassed it, and later New York. And sort of what happened is, and this gets into too much history, but before the War of 1812, Jefferson had an embargo which pretty much killed off Salem commerce. In any case, so to work in the custom house is to really be at the clearinghouse, looking at the manifests, looking at the goods that are coming in, seeing who owes what to whom, so forth and so on. So it's an important but very political job. These were political appointments. The next major one, was the Salem Custom House. And this was, he got this during the Polk administration. After Hawthorne was married, he and his bride, Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, moved to Concord, Massachusetts, where they rented a house. She was painting, he was writing. They weren't making a lot of money. They were really poor. And so friends of Hawthorne's, like Pierce, everybody else he knew. He knew a number of very political people. John O'Sullivan, the man who coined the term manifest destiny, all worked hard to get Hawthorne almost literally out of the kitchen, because they couldn't afford hired help and his wife was pregnant, into a political appointment. And they went to Bancroft and whoever else they had to once the Democrats were back in power. Eventually Hawthorne got the Salem Custom House, which he wanted very much. The family moved back to Salem, and he was there until a rotation in office. Democrats are voted out, the Whigs are voted in, Hawthorne was kicked out, and there was quite a brouhaha. So that was the next major appointment, and that lasted until 1849. It developed out of Jackson. It's the sort of Jacksonian Democrats, and the Democratic Party in those years was more like today's Republicans. Important to sort of remember who became what. The Democrats stood very strongly for states' rights, and as a result, early on, they became a party associated with expansion, manifest destiny, as I said, expanding territories to the west, even to the south, and partly as a consequence of that, they also became associated with pro-slavery. A large part of the Democratic Party was pro-slavery, was a pro-slavery wing. It separated out later on as politics got even more dicey than they were. But it was also a progressive party in that it was for the working person. It stood against a kind of moneyed capitalist aristocracy, say, of Boston, which was associated with the Whigs. So by Hawthorne and then Pierce and his friends at Bowdoin joining with the Jacksonian Democrats, they felt that they were joining with something that was youthful, exciting, exuberant, offered a kind of real hope egalitarianism for America, which was true as long as you were white and male. But that was true, and that was the vision. So it was a kind of, it was a kind of party in a sense of optimism, a kind of party of reform, too, which is interesting, because then later when it becomes associated with pro-slavery forces, we tend to then think of that party as being conservative, benighted, reactionary. It was more complicated than that. The Republicans rose out of the Whig Party that was against the Democrats, and the anti-slavery Whigs, or the conscience Whigs, and the anti-slavery Democrats joined forces eventually by 1860, elected Lincoln as a Republican. Hawthorne stayed true to the Democratic Party all the way through, even though lots of people left it, became either, if they didn't become Whigs, that would be too hard, went to the Republicans, because after all, the Republicans seemed to promise some of the things that the Democrats stood for, but also anti-slavery. Hawthorne did not. So he was in he stayed with the most conservative part of the Democratic Party, which eventually fell apart. That helped cause, I mean, these were the Cook General, well, there was one in Lenox, was a black woman who came in, and in Concord, there was an Irish woman who came in and worked really for pennies. So that even the poor middle-class whites, or the sort of lower middle-class whites, were better off than the immigrants. Then he had a big one. Then he had an exciting one. When Franklin Pierce was running for office in the election of 1852, his friend, Nathaniel Hawthorne, wrote the campaign biography, which was basically out there in order to sell Pierce's candidacy. Now, Hawthorne, as we've established, wasn't a best-selling author, but he was pretty much a household name. He was already fairly canonical, which is interesting, because Hawthorne's stock has never gone down. So here he is, writing the campaign biography of Franklin Pierce, he who writes so-called high art. To reward him, which was probably part of the plan, and there's nothing wrong with it, Pierce gave him, Hawthorne, the lucrative post in Liverpool, which is the consul, sort of an ambassadorial post in Liverpool, England, another major port. And it was intended by Hawthorne and Pierce for Hawthorne to go there, spend the 4 years, and to use Hawthorne's term, bag as much money as he could, so eventually he could come back to the United States and not have to worry about an income. He was a man who really had to worry about how to live. You know, Emerson didn't have to worry about it in the same way, for example, because he had a legacy. His first wife left him enough money. Hawthorne was always worried about getting food on the table for his 3 children and his wife. So this was a political appointment that was manufactured really for him. I mean, it already existed, but given to Hawthorne because Hawthorne really needed it very much. There were psychological reasons where it's useful for him too, but those were the economic ones. He did well, as I said. He came back. There was corruption in a sense, but not corruption that he was corrupt, but built into the system. In fact, one of the reasons he began to think about quitting was that there were consular laws or bills being passed and talked about in Congress to put an end to the, I guess we'd almost call them kickbacks. Every time Hawthorne signed an official sheet, something coming in, manifest or okayed shipments, he would get money basically under the table, so that and it was legal. This was a legal procedure. So people in these posts knew that not only did they get the allowance for their family and their housing and whatever, but also that they were allowed to take, it wasn't even under the table, they were allowed to take, for their signature on every official document, a couple of dollars. It added up quite quickly. He knew it, everybody knew it. That was part of the deal. That's why there were reform laws that started in the 1850s. And as soon as Hawthorne got wind of that, Pierce tried to delay them a little bit because he knew what was happening. Hawthorne thought, I better get, there's no point to staying. That's how he made it. Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating. Well, first of all, it's Hawthorne. It has the signature of Hawthorne. The sentences are elegant and beautifully balanced. And he gives on one hand and takes away on the other. He won't perjure himself. He won't say, you know, Pierce is a great person. He says Pierce is great for the job, something like that. But from another point of view, you know, quite not just literary, although literary is connected to it, it also demonstrates Hawthorne's view of the Constitution, of slavery, and of politics. He's not mincing words. He doesn't have the veil in front of his face. He's very clear about what he thinks and what he thinks about what Pierce thinks. And because Pierce backs the Constitution, Hawthorne thinks he's the man for the job, because Hawthorne himself believes in the Constitution, which makes sense when you think about him. He was a cynical man who was conscious that we're capable of doing terrible things to one another. And for him, law, the Constitution, is a kind of document that prevents demagoguery, the demagoguery of, say, the witch trials or whatever in the, you know, in the 17th century, or the demagoguery that he would be a little bit skeptical about vis-a-vis Lincoln. You know, it prevents mob rule, all of those things. He really believed in the Constitution. Why was he pro-slavery in that way? I think because he lacked the imagination to think of what it really is to be a slave. You know, I mean, I think it's a real failure. It's a failure of moral nerve, and it's a failure of imagination that comes to Pierce. That he didn't bother to think about it. He never got beyond the rule of law, so it wasn't real to him. Maybe being from the Northeast had something to do with it. Maybe being, as most people were, whether it was Hawthorne at one extreme or even Theodore Parker at the other extreme, maybe being racist had something to do with it. But he believed that, and maybe there was some validity to one argument, that if the institution of slavery, the institution, is reprehensible, which it is. They agreed about that. They disagreed about the means by which it should be changed. And in a sense, Pierce was a quietist. Pierce thought you just leave it alone and eventually it'll go away. Hawthorne thought that too, actually. Dark horse. You know, I mean, the sort of mechanics of the election of 1852 were such that he was able to get in. I don't remember on which ballot, but eventually he was able to get in. And it was also because he offended the least amount of people. He was one of those kinds of candidates that, you know, the South could deal with him. The South thought it was okay. And the North, well, he was still a Northerner. He's still, as you said, from Concord. So that he represented the North and the South, and he tried not to say too much. He wouldn't talk about the fugitive slave law, for example, even though he was for it. And because people liked him. He was evidently, to meet him, a very personable, charming guy. Yeah, they were. As I mentioned, Hawthorne was ill. He'd been progressively ill. It's hard to say exactly what he had. And he'd already taken one failed journey for his health, very tragically, because one of his editors happened to die on that trip. So Hawthorne's health clearly didn't improve, especially to the extent that it was psychologically driven. And his wife, Sophia, thought that it would be good for him to take another trip. The only person he would go with is Franklin Pierce. He loved Pierce. You want to talk about people loving each other. These two men loved each other. And Pierce came to Boston, and Sophia took Nathaniel into Boston, and they went in Pierce's carriage up through New Hampshire and eventually they went to Plymouth, and that's where Hawthorne died in the Pemigewasset Inn in Plymouth. Concord, Massachusetts, yeah. I was visiting a group of Hawthornes in Connecticut early on, actually, and one of them pressed a phone number into my hand, and she said a niece of hers had found an old tin trunk under a leaky pipe, and by the time I got home, the niece had called. I went out there, and she had a trunk filled with family letters that went way into the 20th century. There were no letters of Hawthorne, but there were a lot of letters of his wife, and of his children and of his sister-in-law, and there was some material of Longfellow and Emerson. It was wonderful. Julian's descendants. Julian, son of Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne had 3 children, 1 son. The son had 10 children, 8 of whom lived, so he was a lot of children. And these descendants, through Julian, through these 8 great-grandchildren, they're all over the place. Well, I learned a great deal about life in the Hawthorne household. I learned a tremendous amount about her because she was, as a wife, she was Hawthorne's best and most faithful publicist, both within the family and outside the family. She was wonderful to him. She was ebullient and undaunted in her faith in him. I also learned a lot about how they raised their children, what they read, what they ate. There was an enormous amount that I learned through her letters because she was unreserved. Where he was reserved, she was unreserved. And she wrote. I don't know how people had the time to write the kinds of letters that they wrote and do everything else they did in a day. So if I had 2 sisters, rather, there were 3 of them, and the one you're probably referring to is Elizabeth. We mentioned her before. And Elizabeth was the take-charge sister, never married, who in a sense felt she, and in a way, discovered Hawthorne for the Peabody family, and became also his publicist, booster, helped him get the job in the Boston Custom House, and very likely fell in love with him. This Peabody family has Sophia, the sister married Hawthorne, Mary Peabody, who married Horace Mann, the educator and also the congressman, and then Elizabeth, who actually brought kindergarten to the United States. So they were very interesting. Well, she read about it. She went over to Germany. She was a school teacher. She worked with Bronson Alcott, and she developed early childhood education techniques. So Bronson Alcott and Hawthorne are that generation, and then Louisa May Alcott is Bronson Alcott's daughter, and say, for example, Henry James Sr., the next Henry James would be that one generation down. Horace Mann, brother-in-law to Nathaniel Hawthorne, anti-slavery activist, but not an abolitionist, was horrified when Hawthorne wrote the book we were talking about, The Life of Franklin Pierce. He said, how could he write such a book, basically? Is he such a man that would do this? So that's his brother-in-law. Emerson, neighbor. In Concord, Mass., the first place that Hawthorne lived in Concord, Mass., with his wife was rented from Emerson's step-grandfather. I mean, it's very almost incestuous in a certain sense. It's a very small community. They rented that. That's where the newlyweds lived. No. They lived there from the time of their marriage, 1842, to the time they basically had to leave because they couldn't afford the rent anymore, and that was 3 years later. And that's when they went back to Salem. Absolutely. Absolutely. And Thoreau worked for Emerson, was friends with Emerson, so sort of, in some sense, 2T of Emerson, but then from some points of view surpassed Emerson. Hawthorne and Thoreau were good friends, too. In some ways better friends than Hawthorne and Emerson, who were more like rivals. Hawthorne bought Thoreau's boat, called the Pond Lily, that to help Thoreau out. Thoreau didn't have much money either, but he really liked Thoreau, respected Thoreau. They were both kind of sardonic men, unusual men, eccentric men, and in some ways loners. If you mean why did they each go there, I think it's in Maine, all right? It's in, and I'm Brunswick, Maine. And it's still there. Probably looks very, very similar to the way it looked then. Beautiful campus, very chilly in the winter. I mean, now, even with central heating, I imagine it was, for me anyway, it would have been horrible. So I think that the students often warmed themselves with quite a bit of liquor. In any event, Longfellow went there, I think, for different kinds of reasons than Pierce or Hawthorne did. Longfellow came from a well-established family in Maine, and his father was on the Board of Trustees. So Longfellow was in a different literary and political society than Hawthorne and Pierce. Hawthorne was coming. His family sent him to Bowdoin because they liked the orthodoxy, the religious orthodoxy of Bowdoin, And although Hawthorne didn't appreciate that, as it turned out, he liked the politics that were available to him, which was the sort of young America Democrats. So that's why they all went there. Hawthorne and Longfellow didn't know each other well. They knew each other. They didn't know each other well at Bowdoin. It was afterwards that they got in touch. And Longfellow is probably one of the nicest men in American literature. Very generous, very kind, and really helpful to Hawthorne in his early career. That's a good question. I wish I could think of something snappy offhand, but what I do say as a counter, you know, to show how unusual it is, I would say to people, Hawthorne and Pierce's relationship would be as if, or to sort of one is like J.D. Salinger writing a campaign biography of George Bush. I mean, one doesn't imagine that in that way. I imagine that there probably are people who might do it, but no one springs to mind because we generally separate out politics and art. Politics is here, art is over there, and they're not supposed to come together. You know, and Clinton was sort of, you know, straddled that in a certain way. He brought in sort of rock music and pop art and Hollywood into the political arena. High art still sort of stays, well, what passes for high art stays pretty much by itself in that realm. Well, yeah, I mean, it would be inappropriate probably to name names, but let me say this. Well, I mean, it happens. It's not the kind of work I'm interested in, but someone like Saul Bellow, for example, you could say that there's a political side to his character, although not directly so, but, you know, not working in government. He's still alive and had a very larger than this biography written about him. So in 150 years, whatever, you know, part of the sort of heft of a book like this too is it has to do with creating a kind of record. Much forgetting the index, but the notes are there for other people who want to write their own books or check me out or something. And I always consider it two books. There's the notes for the people who are interested in that, and then there's the text that I don't want to interrupt the story, in a sense, with the material for the notes. I think a number of people were literate. There were lots of newspapers, lots of magazines, even more, becoming more and more magazines. I mean, there was a penny press developing too. Sure. Yeah, well, yeah, like now. I mean, you know, it wouldn't seem like a lot if we didn't have the other figures to say that some books really sold quite a bit. But people knew who he was, and probably since he died, more and more became more and more valuable. You know, especially as it became more and more part of, as I said before, a school curriculum. You know, that accounts for sales right there. And then the Scarlet Letter itself almost has its own life. You know, there are plays, movies, operas based on it. Susan Lori Parks did a kind of takeoff on it, you know, in New York last year. So it's become part of the fabric, really. I started the book shortly after, not too long after, I finished the last one, so it was around the end of '96. I started feelers, you know, what was available, was it really a good book to write, what would Hawthorne people think about it, was, you know, things like that. The last major one was over 20 years ago, and there was one, but there was one in between. There was more sort of a Freudian analysis in 1990. On a full-time basis, I like to think I write, but I also teach. And like Hawthorne, I'm not in the government. I don't have government jobs, but I teach. I teach for a living. I teach, and I have taught for many years at Union College in Schenectady, New York. It's the first non-sectarian college in the United States, which is really rather remarkable given the sectarian nature of early American education, and started in the 18th century, so it has a long, venerable tradition. Let's see, Henry James's grandfather was a trustee, 20-some years. I'm from New England. My father's from Salem, Massachusetts. I'm from Haverhill, Massachusetts, which is a mill town or a factory town in the Merrimack River Valley in northeast Massachusetts. And from there, I went not very far to college. I went to Brandeis University, which is in Waltham. I studied American and English literature primarily. I love to read. Where did I get it? Where did I get my love to read?
Yeah.
Escape, probably. My parents do it. My father's a slow reader. My mother's a faster, more prolific reader. But I think I read obsessively, and they don't. And I think I started reading obsessively at a very young age, as I said, as a kind of travel in a way. It was a wonderful form of escape and almost self-education. And I had a complicated childhood, so I spent a lot of time reading and alone doing that, as probably a lot of readers do. Readers want to become writers, really, in some ways. You want to answer back, I think. And so I think that's probably where it began. I don't enter into my own books. I mean, I'm sure that there are all kinds of psychological reasons, even to choose Hawthorne, who's a New England author, is very appealing to me, because I felt, rightly and wrongly, that I knew the territory, that I know where he's from. I know what it's like to be from Massachusetts. I don't think it's changed all that much in the last, 200 years in a certain way. I mean, of course it has in other ways, certainly. So, that was interesting to me. Janet Flanner, the Paris correspondent for the New Yorker. Well, I was actually looking for a subject. I wanted to write about a woman, and someone told me that her papers were here in Washington at the Library of Congress, and I came down to look at them, and they cried out for a biography. It seemed to me, I hadn't really thought about biography, because it was the story of so many people wrapped in her life, and the only way to do it justice, I felt, was to tell it as a life story, and it's a wonderful narrative, I found so interesting. So that's how that happened. My husband, it was his turn. It started with my grandparents, then to my parents, and now the rest are for him. Who did I write it for? Gertrude Stein has a wonderful line, and it's true, I think. She has a lot of wonderful lines, and hers is, I write for myself and strangers. So when I say you, I'm not being glib exactly. I write it for myself. I write the book I want to read, in a sense. I hope to write the book that I want to read, that I won't not want to read sometime from now, even when nobody else wants to. But also for strangers, because I want to tell a story and to affect people, to set up that kind of communication about things and people and places that I think are important. When one thinks of Hawthorne, one thinks of guilt. There seems to be a kind of shadow of guilt over everything he writes. He's also a man obsessed by the past. His past, the history of the country, the things we did yesterday, conscience, however you talk about the past. I thought that instead of beginning his life with the past, which is the conventional, traditional form for a biography, I would begin it in the future, because from some points of view, the future is the past. And so I began the story of Hawthorne telling you, the reader, about his children, because I thought that understanding what happens to his children is a way of understanding a kind of story that gives us an insight into who he is and was. Not that it's a causal relationship. He wasn't an ex-father that created these children, but because certain patterns in people's lives get repeated over and over, and we can almost see in the strange lives of his children, we can see certain obsessions and preoccupations of his. His son is the guilty party, Julian, at the beginning of the book. He has been called guilty by a New York court who's about to sentence him for mail fraud, but the real crime was trafficking the Hawthorne name, selling shares in a phony mining stock. So here you have the son of a very famous father, and I've often wondered what happens to the sons outside of politics, that is, the sons of very famous fathers or mothers, what happens to the children? Well, Julian's in his 60s and he's going to jail because he's a Hawthorne, and because he was very conflicted about the Hawthorne name, as his own father was conflicted about that name, because the father was the great-great-grandson of hanging witch judges. So that's why the guilt. Oh yeah, almost a year. I mean, he got some time off for time served, but it was almost a year. He was in a penitentiary in Atlanta. Very, very recently, Rose is the youngest of the three, very, very recently a cause was opened up on behalf of Rose Hawthorne. That means that the church is going to put her up, the Catholic Church, for sainthood. It may take 10 years, probably take 100, somewhere in between there. So the daughter of the Puritans became basically a Catholic nun and founded what is more or less the first hospice in the United States for indigent cancer patients, and it still exists in, guess where? It's all like a Hawthorne story, a place called Hawthorne, New York. It was named for father and daughter primarily. So Rose is going to be a saint, Julian's a criminal, and Una, the firstborn, she died very young. In a sense, like her father, it's not clear why she died. She had an unhappy life, and she was what we would call today probably clinically depressed. And it may have had somatic sources. She had malaria as a young girl in Rome. 2 years, about 2 years. It was the late 1830s that Elizabeth more or less found Hawthorne, championed Hawthorne, thought he was the most wonderful writer. She was given to great enthusiasms, but she meant them and she was sincere about them, brought him home. Sophia, her youngest sister, seemed to be an invalid. She had the headache a lot, and she was unavailable. No one thought she would marry. People thought she would, just be retiring in her room, painting, and that. Under Elizabeth's nose, more or less, Sophia and Nathaniel began flirting, and Elizabeth was gracious about it. They were married from 1842 to 64, so that's 20, exceptionally. Oh, absolutely, and in death, even more loyal, absolutely. She died in 1871, so she was still fairly young herself. Her health improved enormously because a lot of her problems were psychosomatic, and the marriage helped them. But she was also given to somatic ways of dealing with stress, and she got bronchitis, and she died in 1871. She wasn't really going to last very long without him. I think yes and no. I mean, I think there was a sardonic side to him. He would feel embittered partly for the years of neglect, to suffer so, and then find this, and never to have really enjoyed the fruits. There was that. I mean, of course, he'd be delighted in a way, but I think there would be a way in which once a person like him feels so neglected, as I said, I think he never quite got over it, and it was hard for him. So that there would be a sort of grim sense of satisfaction that he would take in that. It's a story of what we today call a single mother. She was unwed, Hester Prynne, unwed, and will not. I'm sorry, she was wed. But she was wed to not the father of her child, and so she bears an illegitimate child. And the Puritan community in Boston, 17th century, where she lives, will have nothing of it, and they put an A on her, and she raises the child for 7 years and never discloses the name of the child's father, which, had she done that, life would have been easier for her. The child's father, of course, is the town reverend, a man of great piety and beloved by his congregation, so there are ironies within ironies there. No, I mean, there were true stories like it. I mean, women were forced to wear A's, or sometimes in the case, interestingly enough, in some cases, ADs for adultery, and father of Hester's child is Arthur Dimmesdale, A.D., so anybody in the community could have gotten it, but of course, you know, Hawthorne is satirizing the community there too. Very, very powerful for two reasons, not just because of the kind of scandalous nature of the story, which it was, and passionate, powerful story. I mean, it's an amazing woman at the center of this book who really stays true to herself, no matter how she's excoriated or punished, but also because he appended to the front of it a little essay about his being booted out of the custom house. We talked about that, in which he sent up, you know, he satirized all the custom house cohorts and told that he'd been fired in no uncertain terms. So the first part of the book created a kind of scandal that's not scandalous to us anymore today. And then, of course, the second part of the book seems shocking. It's a novel of adultery. How dare you? That is a wonderful portrait of Nathaniel Hawthorne that actually hangs in a club in New York City. And it was done of him when he was about 46 years old. Thank you.